Okay, so here we're doing the fun part. Now I've done this several times on video before, but I figured I'd show it again. What you see here is I've got my Harbor Freight gear puller set up to pull the drive hub off this crankcase so I can get the bearings out. Now this is the one I normally use for larger engines, and you can see I've had to modify these jaws to do that. This would not fit on this size engine because of the thickness of the groove here. So I had, this set came as a 3-puller set. So I just quickly spent about 15-20 minutes grinding the tongs down on this so that hopefully this will work. So I've got it on here initially, and what I want to do is I want to just put some tension on it. Oh, well, I put some tension on it and it already popped right off. So what happens sometimes is that when these engines have been run a long time, this is such a strong friction or mechanical bond on there that you have to put these pullers on there. And what I will do is I'll tension it up real heavy, and if I can't just pop it off just like you saw there by hand without heating it up, I'll just put and leave a lot of tension on it. And I've already pre-oiled this, so I put 3-in-1 oil in there just in case, because I always do that first. And if you can't just pop it off by hand, I'll just put a lot of tension on it, just set it down and just heat it. And eventually the expansion rates of the aluminum and whatever this collet's made out of, brass, and then the steel, the crankshaft, come into play, and eventually it just goes pop and it just pops off. But in this case, it popped off already, so that part's done. Now all I'm going to do is tap this crankshaft out. I'm going to heat this all up now. Tap this crankshaft out and get these bearings out. Okay, I'm going to take the timing gear out of here so I can clean this up. Now, being that this is and my cam followers are still in here, seeing as this is a really old engine, I'm looking in here and I see it looks like metal spacers in here when I actually kind of expected that I would see the little Teflon spacers. So that's interesting because many of these older engines have Teflon spacers in there. But so here's how you disassemble this timing case. There's a little set screw in here that I've heard many people don't really know about, and it's like a 1.5 millimeter. So you have to loosen this up. You don't have to remove it completely, but that engages in a cutout in that drive or pinion. So now I'm just going to use the appropriate size punch and then just kind of push this thing out. So let's see. Oh, I was right. It is Teflon. That's what I was expecting to see. I didn't think they went to the metal or the steel washers for some time. So that just goes to help prove the vintage of this engine also. So now these things are apart. I can put them in with my parts that are going to get cleaned. Now, I did just remove the crankshaft and bearings from this engine. I didn't show that on video because, well, I've shown it a million times before. But with this 50, and maybe even some versions of the 65, the crankshaft has this little roll pin in here that holds, because obviously you can see this isn't the Saito crankshaft that has the gears or the teeth cut into it for the timing, as a lot of the larger engines do, or the more modern ones. So what they were using at that time was a pinion gear like this that has a cutout in it. So that cutout goes in there and it engages in that roll pin. Now in addition to that, there's this spacer which is just takes up the space from the rest of the crankcase till it gets to the front bearing. That's really all that does. So I've got those pieces off. Let's feel. That front bearing doesn't feel too bad. It's this rear bearing that's pretty gnarly. So I've got new bearings that I'm going to replace it with, but instead of using the ultrasonic cleaner today to clean these parts, I'm going to do something a little bit different. And I'm just going to put them in a tub here, because I'm really not planning on doing the head or the carb or anything like that. And heck, this thing doesn't even really need it. It's perfectly clean. I'm going to pop these old cam followers out real quick. And look how brand new and shiny these things look. So I mean, none of these things really need to be cleaned, but there are some things that I'm going to clean up. And what I'm going to use is I'm just going to use some of my LA's Totally Awesome cleaner. A used toothbrush. We're going to do a toothbrush cleaning of this engine. This is what I'll do sometimes when I've got a very light duty cleaning that needs to be done. Okay, so as I often do, I show you the clean parts. Now I just did, like you saw, just a kind of a whore bath where I just kind of did a real quick toothbrush clean because first of all, this engine wasn't really all that dirty. There's still a little bit of stuff in there. I don't really care. It's not going to a customer. It's my personal engine, so it's not a big deal to me. But I did not lube and oil these parts up like I should have, so they just finished getting cleaned with the alcohol, so now it's time to oil them. And you can watch me as I do that. It's really exciting. But anyway, so these are clean parts. I've got a new set of bearings here, and I'm going to go ahead and start reassembling this engine. And then probably the next video you'll see will be of this thing running and being a lot nicer to run. Okay, there's one thing I'm going to show you here that I don't know that I've actually covered before. Now, ideally, well, I won't say ideally, many people feel the best way to insert a rear bearing is like this. I always put the front bearing in, and then you put this in here, and then you use a socket or something like that it contacts it on the outer edges, and you press it in. Well, I like to do things a little bit differently to make sure that I'm not putting this in at an angle at all, and I know that this has never damaged an engine of mine. What I like to do is I put the bearing on the crankshaft first, but because this is a Saito 50 engine and it doesn't have the teeth cut in here, and it uses this pinion gear. This pinion gear is actually a larger diameter than the ID of this bearing. So if you're going to do this, you need to put your bearing on first, as such. And if it doesn't go all the way in, that's fine, because that's when I use my press still to put this in place. Now I put this gear in place and then the washer. Now what's going to happen is I'm going to go heat this case up, put this whole assembly in here, and then push it all in place. And that way you've got your spacer, you've got your gear, and you've got your bearing in place. You don't have to worry about doing that the wrong way, because believe me, I have done it when I omitted this and then I ended up having to do the whole damn thing over again. So that's a tip for installing a rear bearing on a Saito 50 or other Saito, small Saito engine that incorporates this pinion gear.